Hello, and welcome to another episode of a Rod Review. Today I will be looking at the final episode of each Star Trek series and trying to determine if any of them are any good. I should start by pointing out that I've always been a fan of Star Trek and all of its series, minus the most recent shows. But, that being said, I've always found that the series finales were often disappointing. So I will be going through the final episodes of the original series, The Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise. I will give a brief introduction to the plot of each episode, review it, and then finish off with my conclusion. So, without further ado, let's get stuck in. This episode of the original series sees the Enterprise responding to a medical emergency on the planet Camus 2. After beaming down, the away team is split up and Kirk ends up alone with Dr. Janice Lester, an old flame of his. Dr. Lester holds a misplaced grudge against Kirk, because Starfleet regulations have prevented her, as a woman, from ever becoming a captain while allowing him, as a man, to pass on up the chain of command. She paralyzes him with an alien artifact, and then uses it to swap consciousnesses with him. Now in the body of Kirk, she assumes his role as captain of the Enterprise. As the episode progresses, the Enterprise crew slowly begin to realize that something is not right with their captain. This episode suffers from some cringe-worthy lines regarding women, particularly to viewers in the 21st century, and William Shatner's hammy portrayal of Dr. Lester when she is possessing Kirk's body. That being said, it does have its moments where the crew members have to confront whether or not the captain is really himself, and it does cover the dilemma of whether or not it is right for a crew to remove their captain from command, based on aberrations of their behaviour. It also deals with the subject of how do you know who someone is? Is it from their appearance, sound, and position in society? Or is it from their behaviour and personality? This episode covers some interesting issues and ideas that I think another writer could have covered with a bit more grace. But it's the same lack of grace that applies to all of the original series episodes. It still has the same charisma, nostalgia impact, and rough intellect that make the original Star Trek enjoyable half a century later. I don't think this episode is one of the best of the original series, but I think I'd put it in the top half of the original series episodes. So yes, there is at least one enjoyable series finale, but are there more? In this episode, Captain Picard finds himself jumping intermittently from the present to the past, and then on to the future. Q visits him and tells him that he is being tested again. As Picard tries to uncover what is going on, a temporal anomaly in the Devron system emerges as the focal point for each time frame. Given that the Devron system is located in the Romulan neutral zone, this makes the investigation more dangerous. While skipping from time period to time period, Picard discovers that the anomaly expands the further back in time he travels. Trying to get more information on what the anomaly is, he instructs the various data to probe it by shooting a sustained tachyon beam into it. After another meeting with Q, it is revealed that the anomaly threatens life on Earth, as by the time life emerges, the anomaly has grown big enough to prevent it from ever occurring. It is revealed that the tachyon beams used to probe the anomaly are the cause of its expansion, as in the future the anomaly barely existed until the first tachyon beam was fired at it. Armed with this information, Picard consults Data about a way to close the anomaly, and Data tells him that the anomaly can only be closed by generating static warp shells in all three time frames. The plan works despite the destruction of all three Enterprises. Picard wakes up in Q's judgment chamber, and Q tells him that in solving the problem, he has reached only a small fraction of humanity's potential. The episode finishes with Picard joining the other officers in their poker game and Troy telling him he was always welcome. This episode's ending is heartwarming and not soppy like some of the other series finales. However, it frames the Enterprise D crew, people we had been led to believe after 7 series were highly competent, reasoning individuals with a commitment to the Federation and its ideals, as complete idiots who blindly follow the orders of a person directly in charge of them, or the ramblings of a man who is apparently senile, with no thought of the consequences. Let me explain. In Picard's past time frame, he has only just taken charge of the Enterprise, and the ship is about to be sent off to Farpoint Station. This is a nice return to the show's beginning and a chance to see how everything has changed and developed. Picard even has a subspace conversation with Riker, involving the reuse of footage from a similar conversation from the first episode. However, as Picard is aware that Q made an appearance on the way to Farpoint Station, he starts making orders that baffle the crew, ordering the ship on red alert while in space dock, requesting scans for things that aren't there, disobeying a Starfleet order sending them to the neutral zone, and shouting for Q to appear whilst on the bridge. And after all that, he later orders the ship off mission and into the Romulan neutral zone in order to close a seemingly innocuous anomaly. When he makes that order, he makes a speech to the crew, in which he just asks them to trust him. Maybe it's just me, but I would have expected the crew to remove him from command at that point, ordering a red alert while in space dock, something that usually involves arming the ship's weapons and activating the shields, shouting at imaginary beings, and ordering acts that could start an intergalactic war, should certainly count as sufficient grounds to have him declared medically unfit. But when we look at the future time frame, we find Picard as an old man working his family's vineyard and diagnosed with Irumodic syndrome, an incurable illness that can cause brain damage. Telling the visiting Geordi of what is going on, Geordi rationally believes that it's the illness talking and doesn't believe him. When Picard gets aggressive and wants to see Data, Geordi takes him to try and calm him down. In Cambridge, Data is interested in Picard's growing hypothesis and decides that they should take a trip to the Devron system to continue the investigation. So they get a ride with Captain Beverly Crusher on the USS Daedalus, a Federation hospital ship. However, their journey to the region reveals little, as at this point in time the anomaly barely exists. Everyone wants to turn back as there is no evidence to support Picard's rants, but out of loyalty they continue. Picard convinces them to enter what by this point is Klingon space. Currently the Federation is nearly at war with the Klingons, and to gain access they recruit Worf, who is now a governor in the Klingon Empire. However, things go south, and the Daedalus is destroyed by the Klingons, but not before the crew is rescued by a refitted Enterprise D, commanded by Admiral Riker, which helps Picard finish his mission. But again we see that the Enterprise crew engage in acts that could cause the death of millions of lives through war, just to follow the requests of someone who to an outside observer is clearly suffering from dementia. By contrast, Picard's adventures in the current time frame are relatively normal. He is able to confide his predicament in the crew, and they naturally respond with curiosity and by helping him. Apart from the obvious case for Picard being removed from command in the past and into a nursing home in the future, I do enjoy this episode. It has its moments. I like the Worf and Troy romance at the start, with both characters playing their established roles very well. Q is entertaining in this episode and helps to provide insight rather than being annoying and grating on my nerves. In conclusion, while having to suspend disbelief at just how far the crew would be willing to go for their captain, this episode is excellent. as it really centres on the crew's connections to one another, and discreetly makes the point that sometimes disturbing something simply to know what it is not a good idea. This episode covers the end of the Dominion War and finishes off the emissary Prophet's Par-Wraith's Dukat story arc. As the Federation, Klingon and Romulan fleets head off to invade Cardassia, a female changeling orders the destruction of a Cardassian city to prevent Damar's insurgency from spreading. Enraged, Damar responds by planning an attack on Dominion headquarters. Meanwhile, the Alliance and Dominion fleets engage in battle. Partway through, the Cardassian fleet swaps sides and attacks the Dominion in response to the destruction of their city. With their lines collapsing, the Dominion forces retreat back to Cardassia. Seeing it best to finish the war off quickly rather than drag it out, the reinforced alliance now pushes on to Cardassia. While the Jem'Hadar are off committing genocide on the Cardassian population, Damar's cell breaks into the command center and captures the female changeling. After Odo beams down and links with her, she agrees to surrender to the Alliance as long as Odo returns to the Founder's homeworld and cures the rest of the Great Link. The rest of the episode finishes off character arcs that have spanned most of Deep Space Nine, along with Worf's arc that has spanned 7 seasons of The Next Generation and 4 of Deep Space Nine. This part of the episode focuses on saying goodbye to all the main characters and sending them off into their new lives. Bashir and Ezri get together, the O'Briens head back to Earth, Worf is made the Federation ambassador to the Klingon Empire, Odo goes back to cure the Founders and teach them about the solids. Nog becomes a lieutenant, Kira takes over as commander of Deep Space Nine, and immediately begins persecuting Quark, and Sisko dies hurling Dukat into the fire caves to prevent the Par-Wraiths from escaping. The first part of this episode is great, but it should have been added as part of the 8-episode story arc that began with the Breen's alliance with the Dominion. The episode has some good character interactions at the start, where the crew are going about their morning activities before heading off to assault the Dominion. There are some very poignant scenes such as Sisko, Martok and Ross finally getting to drink their blood wine on Cardassia, and neither of the 2 Starfleet officers being able to stomach it. The Cardassian fleet turning sides in the middle of the battle over the annihilation of Lakarian City, and Bashir and Garak saying goodbye to each other on Cardassia. Like I say, the first part should be part of the 8-episode long penultimate story arc, as it finishes it off and has good material and scenes in it. The second part, however, offers nothing of any real value. Unless you fast forward over them, you have to sit through the Kai Wynn and Dukat scenes. The emissary Dukat story is finished off with some phoned-in acting, more in keeping with an 80s Arnold Schwarzenegger movie than acting seen previously in this series. And the rest of the episode is padded out with goodbye scenes and a flashback reel, but is not needed and should have been cut, as should have the Par-Wraith Dukat Kai Wynn scenes. Just skip them and the last 21 minutes, and you have a really good season finale. In this episode, Voyager encounters a future version of Janeway, who has travelled 23 years back in time to help the ship return home before any more of the crew die. Future Janeway tells them to use a wormhole that can take them back to the Alpha Quadrant, and how to arm themselves to survive an encounter with the Borg defending it. After upgrading, the crew heads into the nebula containing the wormhole, where it encounters some Borg cubes which are easily destroyed by Voyager's new armaments. But after breaching the cloud layer, they discover that the wormhole future Janeway has been referring to is part of a Borg transwarp hub. Surprised by the new information, the present Janeway orders the ship to withdraw. Future Janeway and current Janeway have an argument, but ultimately form a new plan. Future Janeway travels to the Borg space city to make a deal with the Queen, but is caught and assimilated. However, it is quickly revealed that prior to leaving Voyager, she infected herself with a pathogen that is uploaded to the collective once she is assimilated. The pathogen starts to rapidly break down the collective and acts as a distraction while Voyager enters the transwarp hub and takes down its supports from within. While escaping, Voyager is attacked and captured by a Borg sphere, but upon its exit from the network, the crew blow the sphere up from within and emerge triumphantly to an awaiting armada of Starfleet ships that escort them on their final leg of their journey back to Earth. I liked that in the future, the Doctor finally decides on a name for himself after 33 years of indecision. It was also good to see that the future Barclay largely overcomes its confidence problems. This episode has a lot of good crew interactions. Paris and Torres finally become parents, and future Janeway gets to be a badass and quip at the Borg Queen just before they die. And I really liked the change between the old pragmatic Janeway, whose worldview has been shaped by the crew she's lost, and the younger optimistic Janeway, whose worldview is shaped by the crew alive around her. I also liked how seeing the younger's relationship with the crew again changed the elder's perspective. A few negatives though. I didn't like that they didn't immediately destroy the Borg cubes on their second attempt to enter the nebula, after they had heavily upgraded their weapons and defences. Janeway just seemed to give them time to start adapting. I'm still not sure why they decided to replace the Borg Queen for this episode. That being said, this is a fun, action-oriented episode that manages a happily ever after without padding the episode with goodbye scenes. This episode is exciting to watch and has a kick-ass conclusion, so I think it can pass as a great series finale. Before I begin, this episode is told from the perspective of Commander Riker and Counselor Troi during the events of the Next Generation episode Pegasus. That episode saw Riker struggling to decide whether or not he should tell Picard about a secret Federation cloaking device on the ship they were trying to recover. Strangely, there is a story arc earlier in this season of Enterprise where Lieutenant Reed is ordered to go behind Archer's back, which covers the same topic of loyalty. Riker might have done better reliving that episode, as this one doesn't cover the subject of loyalty and the chain of command. So I don't think it would be unreasonable to simply call this a Next Generation episode. But, for technicality's sake, I feel I must review it as an Enterprise episode. The part of this episode set in the time frame of the series Enterprise jumps 6 years ahead of a previous episode, Terra Prime. While returning to Earth for the signing of an important treaty between the founding members of the Federation, Shran turns up and asks Archer to help him rescue his daughter from some form of business associates. Despite T'Pol's concerns, Archer agrees, pointing out that this is the sort of cooperation that has made the signing possible. The crew is ultimately successful in rescuing Shran's daughter, but while returning to Earth, the kidnappers somehow manage to board the ship and take Archer and Trip hostage. Trip manages to convince the kidnappers, but he can help them and lures them into a trap during which both he and the kidnappers are killed. In sorrow, the crew return to Earth in time for Archer to make his speech at the signing ceremony. At this point, Riker apparently has learned all he needs to in order to tell Picard about the cloaking device. The pros: it is a good send-off for series seeing Archer walking off to give his speech to the assembled delegates at the end. Even if Archer had already given a good speech about cooperation at the end of a previous episode. But that being said, I think it might have been better to have a story about the founding of the Federation come from a sequel series instead. Getting back on topic, the recreation of the Enterprise D looked great. I like seeing Diana and Riker together again. and commenting on the differences in living conditions between the two different enterprises. I also liked seeing Trip's connection to the ship, with him unnecessarily keeping it in top condition right up to its decommissioning. There the pluses end. The Next Generation story part undermines Riker's decision in the episode Pegasus. In the original episode, he only tells Picard about the Federation cloaking device once it becomes necessary to save the Enterprise, just as he promised earlier in the episode when Picard confronts him about what happened on the Pegasus. Other things I didn't like: the romance that had been developing between Trip and T'Pol over the course of the final season is shown to go nowhere, despite the previous episode bringing them together with a daughter. The fall of Shran is unbelievable, and no effort is made to convince us as to why he fell. The excuse given is that he simply made some bad choices in who to trust in his past and had to go on the run to protect his family. A family that spontaneously appears 1 year after the events of the 4th season of Enterprise, where Shran loses another lover. No judgment, but for someone so torn up to declare a fight to the death to honour her memory, he seems to move on quite quickly after that. Other points of note: T'Pol is overly glammed up in this episode, and her dialogue feels more awkward in comparison to her performances earlier this season. No explanation is given as to how the alien ship that Shran says can only do Warp 2 can catch them after they are travelling at Warp 4, and Riker's uniform disappears when he shuts down the holodeck program, something it never did in the Next Generation. In conclusion, this is the failed season finale, and easily the worst, as it destroys the progress of plots made throughout the season and kind of retcons a good episode of the Next Generation in the process. Overall, yes, there is a great Star Trek series finale, being Voyager's Endgame. Most others are good, if not excellent, albeit with heavy flaws. The original series Turnabout Intruder is philosophical, raising questions about how we know the identity of others, but it is also hammy and blunt with its portrayal of Dr. Janice Lester. The Next Generation's All Good Things is sentimental in a good way, focusing on our attachment to the crew and their attachment to each other, while also providing an original puzzle for Picard to solve. But it does gloss over the need for Picard to be court-martialed in one time period and institutionalized in another. Deep Space Nine's What You Leave Behind is an excellent conclusion to Worf's story and the Dominion War, suitably full of action and tragedy, just as long as you fast forward over all of the Kai Winendu cutscenes and the final 20 minutes. They should have just met in Vic's holosuite program where they have their toast and it cuts to the credits. Enterprise's These Are the Voyages, however, manages to ruin the end to an otherwise good season and one of my favourite TNG episodes at the same time, by destroying the built-up progress of 3 of my favourite characters of that series, Trip, T'Pol and Shran. So yes, there are good season finales. I'd probably rate them in order of favour: Endgame, What You Leave Behind, with fast forwarding, All Good Things, The Turnabout Intruder, and These Are the Voyages. Anyway, that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. As always, please feel free to leave a like, a comment, subscribe, or even share the video. And until next time, goodbye.